Okay, so this is the last night of the series, and I have to say it's been so incredible to talk to all these writers about their obsessions. And every day I've spent pretty much the day with the writer, well, in my head, because I've been reading all their stuff, and so I totally did a college cram and read as much as I could of Ms. Gessen's work, which is not easy, because she's like the most prolific person ever created. So I'll just give you a little bit of a brief about her. She's an activist, she's a writer. She's wrote this beautiful book that I just read today, Esther and Ruzia.
You read it?
Well, I was like, as much as I could. About your grandparents. It's a beautiful book. Man Without a Face, a book about Putin's rise. Words, oh, I'm gonna get this wrong. Words Will Break Cement, The Passion of Pussy Riot. And most recently, I guess, is the gay propaganda book that came out elegantly during the Olympics. And it's a book of, it's sort of an oral history or interviews with gay and lesbian and transgender people in Russia. So anyway, here's Masha Gessen. She's going to talk about her obsession with citizen victims, I suppose. That's a good way to put it.
So I've asked Mike actually to stay up here with me because I'm absolutely terrified talking about this. When the invitation came, it said you don't have to be an expert in this area. There's going to be an expert with you. And so I thought I could go completely out on a limb, and I said something completely insane. And I thought, at least the expert will correct me if this is crazy and unprofessional. But really, this is the essence of my profession. We go and we learn a little bit about something, and then we tell tall tales about it, which is pretty much what I'm going to do. So a few months ago, I listened to a lecture that wasn't actually intended for me to listen to. It was a lecture given by a clinical psychologist for prosecutors working with women who are victims of trafficking and who are trying to get them to testify. It was a wonderful lecture that explained sort of what they need to understand about these women. And it was actually a great example of a professional talking to sort of a lay audience or an audience from a different field. When I listened to this lecture again today, I hadn't heard it since, so I've been developing my obsession completely on my own. I listened to it again today, and I realized that it was accompanied by PowerPoint slides that I never saw. And it also cuts off 40 minutes in, but I think the lecture is about an hour. But anyway, this is what I took away from it. What I took away from it is that there's a thing called coercive control, and which is the key instrument in shaping the victim of something like trafficking or domestic abuse. And in shaping that trauma. And coercive control rests on several elements. One is isolation. And I was listening to this, I thought, okay, isolation, I mean, that's what totalitarian regimes rest on. That's what the Iron Curtain is for. That's what control over the media is for. That's what control over social networks is for. It rests on surveillance. I don't have to explain what role surveillance plays in this. It rests on, and this is where it gets interesting for me actually, it rests on changing demands and unpredictable punishment and reward. And that's really interesting because what she described was women in a situation of trafficking who are supposed to bring in a certain amount of money on a particular night, and then a larger amount of money the next night, and then they're punished for not bringing in that money, or they're not punished for bringing in the money, and the whole thing is completely unpredictable. And of course, I started thinking back to the way that the Soviet regime worked. And one thing that people often don't understand is that it was incredibly fickle. It was not consistent. I mean, one day it was telling the population that the family was sacred, and the next day was telling the population that actually the family was a bourgeois anachronism. One day, there's actually a wonderful book, I'm going to go digress a little here. There's a wonderful book by a former dissident lawyer in which she explains how Russian courts got to be the way they did. And she talks about how the judges were corrupted. And she says the reason the judges were corrupted was that they controlled nothing. So they had all the instruments and the dressing of an incredibly important job. They're supposedly making these huge decisions about people's lives. But in fact, they're supposed to be following the party line, and the party line keeps changing. So one day they're told, you have to punish street hooliganism. And they start giving out 10-year sentences to people who break a street light. And then they're told, the Soviet regime has to be more humane and has to become more lenient. And all of a sudden they start giving out suspended sentences to rapists and violent criminals. And so their agency is taken away. But of course that doesn't just happen to judges, it happens to everybody. One day you're supposed to do this, the next day you're supposed to do that, and if you do it wrong, you have to admit that you're guilty. And this is a key part of control. You have to say, it is my fault that I cannot make $2,000 in a night, or it is my fault that I cannot produce 500 metal parts of this in a day. And of course, there's a whole period in Soviet history that worked that way. It's called the Stakhanovite movement, when the 5-year plan kept expanding, but workers were expected to over-fulfill the plan. And so, even though there were the quota that they were handed down, the production quota, was already pretty stringent, they had to produce double the quota and triple the quota. And so there would be a whole army of people working for one laborer so that he could overfulfill the quota, and then that laborer would be rewarded, but whoever couldn't fulfill the quota had to admit their guilt for not fulfilling the quota. And then, if you admit your guilt that you're guilty of something that actually isn't your fault, that is objectively impossible, then you're rewarded for admitting your guilt. And this is, of course, something, again, that happens in both situations. So, and then the reward. The same thing can be a crime or a transgression or an achievement, depending on what today's rules are. And the same thing can be used as reward and as punishment, depending on what today's rules are. Right? And then the fourth thing that control rests on is the taking away people's ability to plan for the future. So they can't make decisions, they can't think into the future, they can't make decisions again, in this lecture, this professional who knows what she's talking about says that women in a trafficking situation aren't allowed to make decisions about what they wear, where they go, how they behave, what they say. In a totalitarian state, those quotidian things are also tightly controlled, but it's not just that. It's the larger problem of not being able to make decisions about your life. You can't just make decisions about where you live. You can't make decisions about where you work. You can't make decisions about where your kids go to school. All of those decisions are made for you by the state. So you become completely dependent on the state, and you're unable to plan for the future. And part of the trauma that Russians, for example, suffered when the Soviet Union collapsed was that they were suddenly expected to make their own decisions. And they'd never done that before. So they were suddenly living in an unfamiliar situation in which the rules were unclear. They were also changing, although they were not changing at random in order to control them, but they were also changing. But they had never actually made decisions. They had never planned for the future. And when people talk about what traumatized them about the end of the Soviet Union, they often talk about how they were sure of their future before the Soviet Union collapsed, and they couldn't be sure of their future once the Soviet Union collapsed. Which I think is a little bit untrue, because of course the Soviet future also kept changing. But what they really mean to say, I think, is that they couldn't make decisions about their future and they weren't expected to. And suddenly they were expected to and they didn't know how to do it, and things were out of control. So apparently all of these things about coercive control, now we're talking about them in the context of trafficking, but actually this was the first science about it came from studying people who were in concentration camps, who were prisoners of war. So So it's not such a long reach, although it's a pretty long reach, obviously. But then I started thinking that, well, we know that if somebody has been, oh no, wait, there's an important part. There's also this thing called traumatic attachment, which is in the situation of these women who are being trafficked and their pimps, it's the love for the pimp, right? And it's an incredible bond. It's a sacred bond. And by this time, I'm totally in thrall of my discovery that this is a perfect description of the citizen of the totalitarian state who has a sacred bond with the leader of the totalitarian state, and who feels deeply that no one can understand the nature of this relationship, that it really is unlike any other relationship in the world. It is special. It is special to the two of them and to the other 150 million people in the country. But it is a bond that cannot be broken. And yes, maybe there are problems and maybe there's violence, but it's this incredible bond. And then finally, the biggest thing that, maybe it's not the biggest thing, but anyway, it's a big thing. It's all these changing demands and all this unpredictable reward and punishment, and the surveillance, of course, which is super important, produce a state of low-level dread at all times. And that was like my eureka moment. Yes, low-level dread. These people who are constantly frightened because they have seen other people, often people close to them, suffer extreme abuse. This is what happens to you when you see somebody who is in every way like you go to jail. And you basically have two choices. You either fully identify with that person, and then you're completely paralyzed and you can't function, or you don't identify with that person quite fully, and you're actually really horrible and mean to that person, but you say, okay, there's a significant difference between me and him, the guy who went to jail. I'm shorter. I'm like a foot shorter, so I'm definitely not going to jail. But of course you're terrified. But you're not so terrified that you can't function. You're just anxious and worried all the time, which makes you very easy to control and completely incapable of making decisions and planning for the future and having individual agency. So, all of that, now that I have established credibly that citizens of totalitarian states are exactly like victims of abuse or trafficking, we know that if somebody is the victim of abuse and that situation of abuse is taken away, we can't expect that person to function normally, right? It will take a lot of therapy, it will take a lot of intervention, it will take a lot of love, probably won't work anyway, but if it's going to work at all, it will take a lot of that stuff to make that person function. What happens when it's a whole society of people who are all in that state of having been in this horrifyingly abusive situation, and then the situation is taken away? What do? And they don't get any treatment, they don't get any love, and they don't get any help. And well, I think they will do exactly what the victims of abuse do, which is they reproduce the abusive situation in another relationship, or they go back to the abuser, right? It's one or the other, which is what I think my country has done. It's just reproduce the abusive situation, and that's why it's so easy to reproduce, because all I had to do when he came in was sort of give a few signs that he could take that place. And once he gave a few signs that he could take that place, everybody let him take that place, because all the people in the country were like 140 million abused women who just really wanted to be in that relationship again and to have that sacred bond and to have that predictable, unpredictable situation which they don't have to make any decisions and they're constantly under surveillance. And that's what the whole society has been reproducing for the last 15 years. With great success. That's my obsession.
That's your position.
That's my obsession.
Oh, got it. It resonates with me so much, and I feel like you can take it to so many different societies in a way. My first thought is, right after 9/11 here when we were told to shop, you know, and like suddenly everyone's shopping more. You know, we had this, we were so, especially in the city, we were so like obviously traumatized by this thing, and then we were told to shop, and then everyone's suddenly like running around buying more than they used to. Right. And I'm curious, since you moved here last year, right? If you have any stories of witnessing friends or colleagues going back to the abuser in some way?
That's a great question. You know, I think that refugees are by and large different, and that's actually something I've been thinking about a lot because I mean my situation is a little strange. I grew up in Moscow, then I came here when I was a teenager. I went back as a journalist 10 years later, and I stayed. And I just came back here after more than 20 years in Moscow in December because we couldn't stay there anymore. So we're kind of like, we're political exiles, but we're very soft, poor political exiles because I speak the language and my work is transportable and my kids speak the language. So, but as a result, we know quite a few people who are real bona fide refugees, like including people that I met a couple of weeks ago who were a gay male couple, two journalists from Sochi, who literally fled with the shirts on their backs. I mean, their car is at the airport in Sochi, and they just knew they had to run. And but I think that I actually find it very energizing and not at all depressing to be spending a lot of time with these recent refugees, as difficult as their situation is, because they are completely different from my friends back home who are sort of sitting there, ripping their hair out, saying, I'm desperate, it's impossible to live here, the situation is despondent, it's not getting any better, and they're doing nothing about it. And these guys, as difficult again as it is to live in a semi-residential illegal space in Harlem and not know whether you're ever going to get political asylum, they're doing something. And they're actually incredibly inspiring. So, no, I'm not observing anybody go back to the abuser here. I am observing people staying in the abusive relationship in Russia, and they're saying, there's no way I can leave, what am I going to do? Well, something. You're going to do something. You just run away. I mean, again, it's exactly sort of the same dynamic.
It's, this might be too much information, but I have a friend who I feel is in an abusive relationship right now, and it's so hard to get her brain around it, as much as I've tried, and as much therapy as I've tried to guide her to. So it's interesting to me that you're saying there's almost this entire psyche of a country that can't get around the abuse. And it also reminds me of, in Esther and Russia, I think you mentioned that, am I saying her name right? Russia?
Russia, yeah.
Russia,
yeah.
Okay, okay, yeah, I'm Russian. That she, at one point, she was realizing that everything happened so slowly for her. Realizing that the Great Terror was around her was a sort of slow realization. It didn't like suddenly come to her.
Right.
It kind of like crept. It took decades for her to realize it was happening, kind of.
Yeah, but you know what's I'm so glad you mentioned that book. That book is really old, but
I loved it.
But thank you. But it's I feel like I'm sort of crooked here, but it's the reason that I wanted, or one of the reasons I wanted to write about my grandmothers was because I was fascinated with their relationships to terror, I mean state terror, but also the sense of terror. Because one of my grandmothers grew up in the Soviet Union. They're oddly, they're roughly the same age, and they actually became friends in their 20s. So my parents met as children, but they were best friends for half a century. So it's really, in part, it's the story of their friendship. But one of them, Russia, grew up in the Soviet Union. The other one grew up in Poland, which was also sort of not interwar Poland was not a great place for a Jewish person to grow up, but it wasn't a totalitarian state. And so one of them has that fear reflex that's always there, and she's always ready to react. And it's like that low-level dread is always present. And the other one just doesn't. She just doesn't have it. She has lived, she lived in the Soviet Union for more than 50 years. She had to deal with a lot of the same stuff, but it just doesn't scare her.
What about
not
you?
afraid.
Why aren't you? Do you have low-level dread?
I don't think I do, but I think I don't because my parents took me out of that abusive relationship when I was 14, and actually did help me a lot to sort of know what was going on and to face it and to break with it.
So I suppose going back to Russia in '91, that's when you went back, right? You were grateful to see a bunch of crazy American pop culture to go back to and have in your head kind of to sort of as a comparison to what was happening there?
I don't know if it was pop culture.
The reason I'm saying that is because in gay propaganda in the book, there's so many instances of people being like, and then I saw Madonna, and I thought everything was free. You know, like there's this one guy who watches the worst movie ever, The Next Best Thing with Madonna, and that's like his window into like a possible future. And I just think that's so weird how you can't really pick what's gonna cause the liberation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, I don't know if it caused liberation, but I think that, I mean, seeing images of yourself is hugely important. I mean, that's why this book that we did with Joseph F. Hannon, Gay Propaganda Love Stories from Russia, it's a series of first-person narratives, mostly love stories. And it's available for free as an ebook in Russian. It's been downloaded 15,000 times in 2 months, which is kind of amazing, especially because we can't advertise it in Russia. We can, and somehow people are finding it and downloading it, and a lot of them are writing me letters. And it's just, I think the reading about other people like you tells you that you exist and you have a right to exist.
Yeah, it's a really good book, and it's actually, you know, sort of, I mean, we know what's happening over there, but there's so many like life moments of people getting fired from their jobs that, you know, just these really scary, clarifying moments that I keep seeing.
But there are also some nutty moments, which is what I love about that book, is that we led with an interview with 2 women who fought back in an attempt to have one of their children taken away. And so in a way it's a really scary story, but if you don't laugh yourself silly while you're reading it, then you don't have a sense of humor, because the story that they tell and the way that they tell it is so hilarious. The way that they got involved when they were both married to men, and they sort of became lovers because, well, it's kind of more convenient to be lovers with a woman, and it was handy, and they weren't going to like be together or anything. And their husbands were fine with it, and they thought it was really fun. And then one of the husbands fell in love with Twitter, and they're like, fall in love is fine, but on Twitter, so there's that whole sort of side story of falling in love with Twitter.
I'm going on Twitter immediately. Go on. I'm going on Twitter right now to fall in love.
What I love about that story, and the reason that I chose it to be the lead in the book, is that not only is it completely sort of unromantically constructed, but also it's a little window into that crazy way of creating families when you don't have a model to follow as a family, which I think is a good thing.
Mm. Yeah. I'm wondering if, now that you've had this obsession, if you've applied it to any other places besides Russia, any other societies or cultures?
Well, yeah, like any good obsession, it pretty much explains everything. I don't know other countries as well as I know Russia. What I've done actually is I've found bits of evidence elsewhere, because I read one of my books is actually on medical genetics, so I still follow some genetic research as a hobby, so there's this crazy study that some Israeli geneticists did, looking at stressed out, I think rats or maybe mice, but I think they were rats, and their progeny. Now this is when I was actually writing my medical genetics book, which wasn't that long ago, and there's a chapter in it on epigenetics, and at the time it was like sacrilege, like nobody was supposed to believe in epigenetics. And epigenetics is sort of the stuff that makes your genes actually work. And now epigenetics is the thing. And so this is basically a study of epigenetics that suggests that if rats were subjected to particular kinds of stress in before pregnancy, not during pregnancy, but before pregnancy, they produce stressed out progeny. So something changes in the basic hormones of the rat that lead to some gene expression during the pregnancy, and then these genes are expressed more in the progeny, which the Israeli researchers actually link to studies of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, who seem to have inherited some of this anxiety and depression, which of course plays right into my theory. So not only are these societies deeply traumatized, but this trauma is expressed not only on a psychological level in the people who are not surviving intact after the regime collapses, but in their children and grandchildren who are inheriting these stressed out genes. I was told I can really go out on them here.
Go there. I was going to ask you about epigenetics. I looked it up on Wikipedia. So.
Okay, I'm glad I'm ahead of you. So,
yeah.
So yes, I'm thinking the country's doomed. I mean, like all these stressed out rats for generations to come.
Right. And also when you first started talking, I was thinking, okay, my friend is doing a documentary about gay men of my generation and their response to AIDS. I come from this like weird pocket of guys that were too young to watch all their friends die, but old enough to be fucking freaked out when we first came out of the closet. And just us as trauma survivors. And then how it's reflected in the culture, and one of them is this like overarching sense of dread all the time. And it's interesting to me because I feel like it can be a country, it can be a group of people, but you're right. There's this moment of trauma that ripples, I suppose.
So, have you ever read Larry Kramer's book Faggots?
Yeah.
What amazes me about that book actually is it's a book written like 3 or 4 years before AIDS.
Yeah, it's very prescient.
And it kind of predicts AIDS. But for those of you who don't know, Larry Kramer is a great playwright and journalist and activist who, when AIDS first appeared, it didn't have a name yet, and there were 11 men in Los Angeles. And then there were a couple of men in New York, and he started writing about it when the caseload was still in the dozens, and writing these completely over-the-top pieces for a paper called The New York Native, in which he was predicting that this was the epidemic that was going to kill everybody, which seemed insane because there were several dozen cases of a mysterious disease that doctors weren't even sure was the same disease on the two coasts. But of course, for him to have seen AIDS, he had to have predicted AIDS. And he had predicted AIDS in this book that he wrote 3 years earlier. But the reason I thought about it was because he describes this whole community that is gripped, that is doomed, basically. And he's explaining why it's doomed and how we're all doomed to die.
Yeah, and so my friend Jesse Finley Reed, who's doing this documentary, he's just been asking as many people as he can about their experiences and their psycho heads like mine. And but he bases his work on Judith Herman. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's sort of like a forensic psychologist. I'll get you in touch with her.
Thank you.
I'll make my good thing to do for the day. But she has a bunch of different key moments of what a traumatized victim goes through, including like a persistent expectation of danger, the dread, substance abuse, surprise, indelible imprint of the traumatic moment. That's another big key of hers. And then creates maladaptive behavior. I don't know what, that sounds like substance abuse to me, but also that sounds just like a normal night for me.
Yes, I was thinking of substance abuse as well, because of course, how do you deal with having no agency, having constant anxiety, and having very limited freedom?
Yeah.
Well, you drink. I mean so I thought this was also a great theory of everything because it also explained Russian alcoholism.
Right. Okay, questions. I'd like some questions, please. I'll just keep asking if you don't have anybody. Come on. Yes.
I just read an article in the New York Review, not this issue, one before, about the failure of Russian intellectuals to stand up against the top-down dictatorial.
I'm sorry, the top-down
inclination to autocracy. And if they've been mute, if they haven't spoken out as much as they want.
It's the failure of Russian. I'm supposed to repeat the question for the recording. The failure of Russian elections. Intellectuals. To
sort of occupy their place in society is in opposition to autocracy.
In opposition to what?
Autocracy.
To autocracy. Yeah. I don't know if that's true exactly. I mean, I think that. There's a difference between intellectuals and the intelligentsia, right? And the Russian intelligentsia, which is where the word comes from, is this small, very small subgroup of intellectuals who actually feel a personal responsibility for what the country does. It's pretty difficult to, again, claim that kind of. I'm sorry, I keep saying that word like I'm out of a 1980s graduate school, but yes, it's difficult to claim that kind of agency in a country like Russia when you've been told you can't do anything. I mean, you can't protest, you can't vote to any end. Again, you can't make decisions about your life. So it's a very tiny group of people keeps insisting that their voice matters, their opinion matters, and tries to stick to consistent opinion. So you can't expect that to be a large-scale phenomenon. You just can't. On a small scale, it's there. There's, it's certainly there recently. I think that if anything, Russian intelligentsia can be blamed for not standing up in the first, say, 8 years of Putin. That's very true.
In fact, he started the article with that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's. I think that's true. They were very slow to sort of come around to acknowledging what was going on, and to seeing the danger signs and identifying them and speaking out about them. But I think at this point we're pretty much back to the Soviet paradigm, with a very small group of intellectuals who are taking great risks and speaking out. And in fact, Russian pen has been terrific in the last 6 months, and silent up until then.
And then I'm thinking of the beginning of your book, Man Without a Face. Your friend Galina Starovoitova.
But that was good, yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah. Who was a big, very vocal about what I thought was interesting about the mental health of these these Yeltsin appointees, right? Saying like we need to look at their mental health before they get appointed. So it's almost like not just the mental health of the victim, but the mental health of these leaders. And so I guess, and then she was shot and killed. And so that was just the beginning of the sort of, maybe this era that you're talking about, like the sort of the Putin era.
She wasn't actually talking about their mental health. What she was talking about was she was in favor of lustration.
Right.
Lustration is a term that's used in these post-Soviet states to describe a process of basically purging people who served the previous regime, and they're banned from holding certain kinds of jobs for a period of time. So several post-communist countries did that, including the Czech Republic. They identified people who worked for the KGB, who held high posts in government, and they were banned from holding similar jobs for, I think, a certain length of time after the change of regime. In Russia, the idea of lustration never gained traction. There were a lot of things that actually didn't happen in Russia, and I think that I've come to think of them, since I developed this obsession, I've come to think of them as failure to address trauma. it's like it never happened, or maybe it wasn't so bad, or actually now we're starting to think it was really good. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was actually a case pending against the Communist Party that would have been kind of a Nuremberg trial type of thing. It was 70 volumes of documents sort of, showing the human rights abuses, the murders, the gulags, the state control under the Communist Party. And that was supposed to be a big public hearing, and then it was supposed to have consequences. So the Communist Party would have been banned. People who worked for the Communist Party would have been banned. But that never happened. The case was sort of dismissed. The cases against the organizers of the anti-reform coup in August 1991, they were all dismissed. So there was never a public conversation about what everybody had lived through. And it's like, nobody got therapy.
Similar to in South Africa when they held open reparations, which is seen as like one of the best things to do for. Right. And that did not happen in Russia.
It didn't happen in Russia. I mean, to be fair, I think it's very different. If you try comparing what we would have wanted to happen in Russia to what has happened in other countries, you understand just how difficult it is to do something like that in Russia. Because for the Czech Republic to carry out lustration, what they had to do was basically say, we were occupied by an enemy state for half a century, and there were people who served that occupying power, and we're now going to purge those people and punish them by not letting them hold certain kinds of jobs. Right? In South Africa, even though it was called reconciliation, there was also the idea that it was a different group of people who were now holding power to the people who had been in power before. It was a hostile regime. One group of people had been openly hostile to another group of people. So you could clearly divide people into the victims and the executioners. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not what happened in Russia. In Russia, there was no occupying power. You can't divide people into victims and executioners because everybody was a victim and an executioner. Everybody. Everybody took some part in the horrors, and everybody suffered from them to some extent. So basically, we want people to say, we did this to ourselves, and it's the most awful thing that anyone has ever done to us, and we did it to ourselves. And you can't really do that. I mean, the denazification process in Germany is a little bit similar, but not really. Because first of all, the Nazi regime was so short-lived. And second of all, again, it was kind of carried out by an occupying power. It was very much, when Germany was going through denazification, it was occupied by the United States. And so, but we want Russia to have done it to itself and to have admitted that it did that awful thing to itself. And I think that's probably just beyond the capacity of human beings.
Well, yes, and that's a reflection of someone who's abused, you're saying, because that's someone who's saying it's my fault, it's my fault.
Well, I think that's where the analogy probably fails, because it's not, see, I thought it explained everything, but it explains almost everything. But
I'm with you, though. I'm with you.
But no, I mean, I think this is where, for example, we have the heads of the Communist Party as the great abusers. And that's what the sacred bond was with, the Communist Party as an entity, and then the person of the leader. But yeah, we also no. The analogy works. See, here's how it works. We enable them to be in power, right? And we abused each other. I mean, that is also what happens in situations of domestic abuse. I mean, we enable abusers. And then if there are other members of the family or the pimps group, then they abuse each other. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, see, it works.
It works. It totally works. But also the lack of self-forgiveness, I think, is a really important part of it too.
Right.
Okay. Question. Yes.
So you said that the prosecutor gave a speech to victims of
It was actually a psychologist who gave a speech to prosecutors.
To prosecutors.
Right.
Okay.
A forensic psychologist, correct? Yeah.
Trauma psychologist, yeah.
Okay.
And so what were the prosecutors to do with that information?
Well, that's a great question. See, although the lecture cuts off, so I can tell you that, I mean, that's kind of where she got to it, but actually I think she was trying to help them understand who they're working with. Because it's apparently these victims are extremely difficult to work with. Because they're annoying, and they're irrational, and they're extremely unsympathetic. And I think she was trying to explain to them how they came to be that way, and how becoming fragmented, and this is the part I don't really understand, so I'm just sort of parroting at you, but becoming fragmented is the coping, the only possible coping mechanism for somebody who has no control. So they just like break their identity into many different pieces, and sometimes you're dealing with one fragment, and other times you're dealing with another fragment, and that's why these people are sort of inconsistent. And so she was sort of trying to tell them, look, that's exactly how they're supposed to be, and that's because they've been abused.
Anyone else? Yes, over here.
This is not so much a question, but more of a comment, because I was interested in your example of Czech Republic, for instance, in terms of reparation and sort of healing, and okay, we won't, hire those same people for the government. But the reality of the situation is, which I'm sure you know, but it's not something to overlook, is that the impact of the trauma on the people and the culture there is so incredibly present. Even though sort of the government has been remedied to an extent, but the sort of, the impact of the trauma and the sort of stunted cultural and social growth is really quite present. And the thing that worries me is this idea that people will continue to be victims of the next system as well, because that victimization is so deep-seated that I feel like actually contemporary Czech culture and politics, democratic and capitalist, people are also still very much being taken advantage of by the new system as well. And so that ripple effect is like, it just keeps kind of echoing.
Well, from what I understand, I mean, working with victims of abuse is like the most difficult work that psychologists do, and the most ungratifying, because most times it doesn't work and people go back to their abusers. And only after they've been in therapy a few times, like they've actually had several courses of therapy, can they have any hope of recovering?
Yes, back there.
As a psychologist, I'm struck by how you're very clearly describing concepts such as versus repetition compulsion. So repetition compulsion is essentially that someone is going to be drawn to a familiar trauma so that they can master it. And I'm wondering...
So they can master it?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, in a way, so it's familiar, and then they repeat the trauma to master, right?
Wow.
And so you were speaking also about the manic defense in 9/11, right? So America felt vulnerable, and then they had to attack in order to gain, connection with the strength, right? And other such concepts. And I'm wondering if you, you're already talking about it. I'm wondering if you incorporated those concepts into your writing.
Yeah, what's the next step, Masha? Get going.
I can do it. I can write it. You're already describing it. Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. She's a psychologist, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
She was just saying that creating some details about how people react, including repetition compulsion.
And you mentioned a lot of things.
Right. Just different features that a victim might go through, including repetition compulsion, where people try to master the abuse in a way.
It's familiar to them, so they repeat it.
Right.
And then they're trying to master it.
Which is that sort of like your typical. is that your typical thing about a sexual abused person becomes a sexual abuser? Is it that kind of the...
No, not exactly. Anyone who experiences abuse, for example, in childhood, will recreate those scenarios unconsciously because it's familiar to them. So they'll be drawn to them, and then they, in an effort for the unconscious to master.
Right, recreating the trauma. Which brings me to, and maybe we can talk about this, any insights you might have about what's happening in Ukraine as a reflection of this, in a way.
Okay. But actually, the question was, am I planning to write about this? Yes, I am planning to. First of all, thank you. It's a relief that a psychologist has actually just vetted this a little bit. Yeah, I've actually pitched it to a couple of magazines, but possibly because I say this is completely insane, but I'm obsessed with this. But it will be a totally speculative story. I haven't had a lot of good response, but maybe I'll figure out a more confident way of putting it. But actually, I haven't had time to really research it. I need to talk to some people. I'm sorry?
You already know it, you just don't know the jargon.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure knowing the jargon is good for my profession, but but yeah, but I do want to write about it. I think there's actually something big there. So yeah.
But do you have any feelings about?
Well, I mean, it's been fascinating and I've written about this a little bit, to watch Russia watching Ukraine, because and what's actually struck me is how, to what an extent the gaze with which the government is watching Ukraine is the same as the gaze with which the anti-government people are watching Ukraine. They want different things. They wish for completely opposite outcomes, but they view it exactly the same way. They view it as a mirror, which it's not. It's actually a different country with a very different culture, a vastly different culture at this point, and a vastly different power structure. It's a country with a transitional form of government, rather than an authoritarian state. And it's actually a country that has had a transitional form of government for many, many years, for nearly a generation. So it's moved away from that situation of total abuse. It's in transition, right? And the Russian government is watching it, and the reason there was such a panicked reaction from the very beginning was that it certainly not only doesn't want to have Ukraine, but it also feels that if Ukrainian protesters succeed, if the pro-Western Ukrainians at this point, not the protesters, the pro-Western Ukrainians succeed, then the same thing might happen in Russia. Well, that's not true. Actually, Russia doesn't have the conditions for that to happen in it. But what's amazing is that the people in the opposition culture also view it the same way. And there was this incredible letter, and actually going to your point about intellectuals, there was this lovely and tragic open letter signed by 30 writers, I think on December 2nd, so early on, to the protesters in Maidan, that said, please, we wish you success, and if you win, we win. And that's not true. It is not. Ukraine is not a part of Russia. A victory for the Maidan does not mean a victory for the opposition in Russia. In fact, it means the opposite for Russia. But I think that it's. I mean, part of it is just the fact that Russians, again, because they didn't do any of the work that needed to be done psychologically after the Soviet Union collapsed. It's like they haven't separated from Ukraine. They don't realize it's a different situation. It's a post-imperial situation in which Ukraine is no longer part of Russia or a reflection of Russia.
Because they're trying to master it, right? Another question? One more? You over here? Oh.
I have a comment and a question. A lot of what you're saying, for me, resonates with the African slaves here in America. That's the comment. But the question is, you speak about victims sort of having the same experience, like the homogenous experience of a huge group of people, but you speak of like fragmented society or thought.
Do you need to repeat that?
I think I do. I'm going to try. No, I think it's really a good point. First of all, that the situation with African slaves is very similar to this, which is totally a good point. And then a society's reactions, if there are different styles of reacting to the trauma. Right. Yeah, it's like a cloud, kind of. It's like a cloud of, like the low-level dread, I think, would be a good example of a cloud of reaction.
Right. So, yeah, that's a fascinating question. Actually, here's where I think, again, my theory of everything is extremely useful. Is there's this other conundrum of studying authoritarian societies or totalitarian societies, is the impossibility of studying public opinion, right? Because we, at this point, we know. I mean, there's some academic research on this, that any study of public opinion in an authoritarian country is completely uninformative. I mean, it can look like it was done correctly, and you know, the language can be good, and the sample can be good, and then public opinion in an authoritarian country will flip in a day. You know, and you know, we saw that happen with polls in the Soviet Union that was collapsing. We saw the same thing happening in Ukraine, and I think it's because a person living in an abusive situation is extremely attuned to the changing demands of the abuser, right? So when you're asking somebody you know, in an authoritarian country, what do you think of X? The question that that person is hearing is, what do you think you're supposed to be saying about X? And depending on what the demand of the abuser is today, that's the answer you're going to get. And it's not insincere. It's what it is. It's what the person, it's how the question is understood and how the question is answered. And there isn't another way to understand the question, because again, I apologize, agency has been completely removed from the situation. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question. But yes, everybody is going in different directions, and sometimes you can't figure out what's going on because, for example, 2 years ago, there was this huge uprising of protests in Russia. And at the height of it, hundreds of thousands of people were demonstrating in 99 cities simultaneously. And I was very much swept up in it, as were obviously a lot of other people, and it felt like this had to bring about change. It's obviously, you can't, you know, things can't just stay the same when this many people think the same thing and are out in the streets. And then things shifted subtly, and all of a sudden there were like 10% of that many people. And you ask people, you know, why were you going to protest a week ago and you're not going now? And you can't get an answer because it's just because that's what it is, because the tides shifted. And I often feel talking to people like that. I have some people in my life to whom I kind of go for that kind of information because I'm clearly missing those receptors. I'm not tuned into the radio waves on which they're transmitting the current nationwide consensus. But they're tuned in. They can tell me exactly what's going on and what the right thing to think is. And they sincerely hold that opinion at that particular moment.
Yeah, back here.
I think we agree, but this is an inevitable question, so I guess it's up to me to ask it. The most celebrated dissidents or protesters to the west of the United States are obviously Pussy Riot. Matter of fact, I believe I saw you maybe it was on Charlie Roosevelt.
Yes.
My sense is, of course you support them, but please, I'm sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase your position, so in order to tell me that I'm completely wrong. But obviously you support Pussy Riot, and it's like a valuable symbol, but my sense was you were pessimistic about their protests, or I don't know, similar protestability, to change things in the short and middle term, including Russia, number one. So I wanted you to, if you could, just expound on that a little bit. And secondly, if the Pussy Riot kind of, you could take a widespread
great question. I feel like you have a very good projected voice, so I don't think I need to repeat it.
Okay. Yes, I mean, I wrote a book about Pussy Riot because I think they're fascinating, and I think they also created a great work of art. I think what they are the first dissidents of this era. And dissidents are different from protesters. Dissidents are individual actors who are generally acting on behalf of other individuals. And I'm afraid that's where we've landed, is basically the access that they have to international media can be most effectively used to draw attention to human rights abuses and to individual cases that no one will hear about, if not for the former members of Pussy Riot, Nadia and Masha, who, because of being Pussy Riot and because of having served 2 years in jail, have the voice of moral authority and have the access. And that's really what they're doing. They have been working very hard to draw attention to the Bolotnaya case, the case of the people who were arrested in connection with the protest at which police incited violence, and who have been sentenced to much longer sentences in jail than Pussy Riot were because of the lack of international attention. They've also, within Russia, they've used their social networks to draw attention to cases of abuse in prisons. So there's a woman in solitary in Mordovia who's been held there for 2 months illegally, and all of a sudden this penal colony in Mordovia gets 1,000 phone calls and they don't know what hit them, and they release the woman and they've saved a life. So that is something that I think they can be extremely effective in. It's not an efficient way of protecting human rights when you need many individuals to protect one individual, but that's how it works in totalitarian societies. They have other ambitions. They, in addition to doing this, they also want to create a broad prison reform movement. They really hope they can change the way the prisons are run in Russia and the way they function. I don't think that can happen. So that's what I'm very pessimistic about. I think that until there's regime change, there can't be reform in any area, much less in the prisons. So.
One more question? Yes, right here.
So my question is partially pedagogical. I'm teaching at NYU and CUNY, and I had recently a really bad interaction with one of my students who is Russian American. She's 20, and I was describing the situation in Ukraine, and she sent me an email after class in which she accused me of culture shaming, that I was very unfair to Russia. And so I'm originally coming from Hungary, so I'm very cynical and all that. So I wouldn't say that I was 100%, I mean, I was cynical. But what was really interesting to me is that here was this girl, she's 20 years old. She was born already in the US with parents who ran away from the Soviet Union. And she definitely had an identity, and something that I hadn't realized was that she was definitely, and that was coming from her family, that also became clear that her identity, like in her view, Putin's system was very different from the Soviet Union. And then I started to talk to my other Russian American students, like I have 3 more, and I slowly realized then I was really careful about approaching this like charged topic of Ukraine, but they all felt the same way. And so I have 2 questions. Like one, how would you just theorize, like trauma-wise, what's happening there with these Russian Americans who all of a sudden totally twist around like their point of views? And my second question is, like pedagogically, like should I even address these young people's biases?
I love how you have seen this magical transformation of me into a trauma expert in the course of
Exactly.
But I will theorize. Yes, actually, because I lecture a lot, most of the time on things that I know something about, and everywhere I go. I usually go to colleges and universities, and everywhere I go, there is a sampling of the local Russian immigrant community. And so over the last year of 30 lectures, I've actually figured a couple of things out about this. One is that it really depends, there are several distinct generations of Russian immigrants. And there are people who really ran away from the Soviet Union. Mostly that's the Jewish immigration of the 70s and 80s. And then there are people who came here in the 90s. And I'd never really thought about them until I started encountering them in all these lectures, sometimes with that kind of rhetoric. Those people were not running away from the Soviet Union. They were running away from the post-Soviet situation, which was the experience of utter chaos. The experience of utter chaos. I lived there at the time. It was not utter chaos, but it was experienced as utter chaos because the controls were gone, because the surveillance system was lifted, because the system of reward and punishment was removed, because it was not clear what the expectations were, because people were suddenly expected to act for themselves. It was so scary that a lot of people ran away from that. And when they ran away from that, their nostalgia for the Soviet Union was not terribly surprising. And then 10 years go by, or 7 years go by, depending on when they ran away, and Putin comes in. And if you tune into Russian television here, which you can do very easily by satellite, you get exactly what they feel, what they were running away from. You get nostalgic post-Soviet propaganda, and on which contemporary Russian patriotism is built, and contemporary Russian anti-Ukrainian sentiment is built. So my bet is that's what you're...
yeah, my student told me about these, like, that we should watch, and I should have shown clips from that.
Right.
Anyway, how should I
But
address
I think you should show clips, because that stuff is so unbelievable that if I were, I mean, I don't know what the makeup of your class is, but if I were you, I'd risk it. I'd risk showing those clips and then having the class fight it out. That might be really fun.
But that translates into culture shaming, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Well, some culture should be shamed, maybe.
Nice. Okay, thank you so much for your time. I expect this book to be done by next year, so
Okay,
you better get
bye-bye.
cracking.
Yes.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Masha.
you.